Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning into the podcast today. It's been a minute since I have created an introduction for a podcast, but I did want to create one for Danny just so we have some background of his resume and who he is for anybody who doesn't know who Danny is. So, we are joined by Danny Sheehan today, a constitutional and public interest attorney with over 5 decades of experience challenging government secrecy and defending democratic oversight. Known for his work on landmark cases such as Watergate, Iran-Contra, the Karen Silkwood case, Danny is now at the forefront of legal efforts surrounding UFO and UAP disclosure. We dive into the growing internal and external pressures on the government to reveal what it knows, ranging from congressional roadblocks and intimidation tactics to media attention sparked by documentaries like The Age of Disclosure. Our conversation explores the legal realities of private aerospace companies holding advanced technologies, the metaphysical and spiritual implications of non-human intelligence, and why citizen activism through efforts like the New Paradigm Institute may be the key to forcing constitutional accountability and transparent disclosure. I had a lot of fun with Danny today. I really hope you guys enjoy this one. Also, as always, if you find this conversation valuable, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below. Your engagement helps keep this conversation going, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. So without further ado, here's Danny Sheehan. All right, Danny, we are rocking and rolling. I really want to thank you for coming on the show. I want to kind of get right into it and get to some questions that have definitely been on my mind, and I'm sure it's been on a lot of people's mind out there in this space.
Sure.
So, first of all, I want to know, or I'm curious about these external pressures being put on the executive branch and probably some of these internal pressures that most people aren't aware of. So we had
You put on the executive branch or the legislative branch?
the executive branch.
Okay, all right.
So, for example, like we've had this documentary, The Age of Disclosure, where you had a
Sure.
lot of decently
Okay.
high level people in there
Yeah,
saying things. And then you have the interviews on Fox News with David Grush, Jay Stratton,
yep,
um,
yep,
and these individuals espousing this, revolutionary information,
yep.
this mind expanding information. What sort of legal mechanisms are happening behind the scenes that maybe people don't know about to add pressure for there to be some sort of announcement?
There's dimensions inside your question that I'd like to address here. It's going to be extremely difficult to get the executive branch to participate in any greater degree of disclosure than the legacy group has decided they want to do. Okay, that they tend to dominate the infrastructures of the executive branch. Okay, they dominate and influence the Central Intelligence Agency's Operations Directorate, the Division on Science and Technology, which is a major key. They influence the Director of National Intelligence in the subdivision inside there that deal with this particular issue. So they've got a structure inside the executive branch pursuant to which a very small number of people at a given time call the shots on what information relating to all of this, and there's a range of information, is going to be disclosed in any kind of official capacity. All right, you'll recall Lou and Davis, Eric Davis, and others. They will say, well, here, I'm telling you this. This is all I've been authorized to tell you. I can't tell you anything more, and they will say things like, there are certain things I can't discuss in public, but I can discuss with you if we were in a skiff, right? But then when you get to Eric Burleson asking the question to Lou that, look, even if we were in a skiff and I ask you to give me the definitive proof to prove that we're in possession of one or more of these non-human origin extraterrestrial spacecraft or any of the bodies of any of the non-human beings that were piloting these, would you be able to give me that information in a skiff? Lou said, no, I wouldn't be allowed to give that to you. That would violate my security clearance. That would have to come from somebody above me. Okay. So that's a dramatic example of the fact that the question is Lou putting pressure on those people by coming and appearing before a committee of Congress and revealing things? Or has Lou been directly authorized by that group to reveal what he's revealing, but prohibited from revealing things that they don't allow him to reveal? Okay. So that's just so people will know that.
But is
Okay.
that the case?
No, it certainly is the case. That
Okay.
is the case with all of them, and they will tell you that. Okay. So the bottom line is, with regard to the executive branch itself revealing any of that information, that's going to be completely controlled by the legacy group. Okay. At any given time. Now, the second question is, can we as the people put adequate pressure on the members of Congress to exercise the authority that they have vis-a-vis the executive branch, to command them, the executive branch, to turn over information at least to the Congress? Okay, now that's a second question buried inside your question, right? And that's clear. And Eric Burleson, who, as you know, has the portfolio basically on the UFO issue, inside the task force on the declassification of government secrets, which is a task force of the House Oversight Committee. He just on January 20th at the National Press Club gathering that took place, announced that unless and until the people of our country engage in an outcry demanding this information, we're not going to be able to get the members of Congress to do anything. Okay. Now, that's despite the fact that the members of Congress have an absolute constitutional obligation to do this, to be given the information so they can exercise their constitutional responsibility under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 14, to be specific,
Mhm.
that explicitly authorizes the Congress to set the rules and regulations governing the military forces of the country. Okay. So that this classification of this information by the executive branch and the military officials and the intelligence agencies is completely subject to the rulings of Congress. Right now, so you ask the question, why is it that the members of Congress wouldn't be doing this themselves? Since
Right.
that's their job, that's their constitutional responsibility. Wouldn't they get fired from any other job if they had the assignment to do that and they refuse to do it? The only people who can fire them are the people. Okay. And so that's
Okay.
why Eric Burleson will say things like that: unless and until the people ourselves engage in trying to put pressure on the members of the Congress by having an outcry demanding this information, they're not going to do it. So it raises the additional question: why wouldn't they do it? Why won't they?
Mhm.
Why won't the members of Congress do that? The answer to that is because the executive branch threatens them. The CIA threatens them, threatens to put money into the campaigns against them. They threaten them physically. We have examples of the wives of some of the members of the Senate being dragged out of bed, in the middle of the night in their nightgown and a gun put in their mouth and told them, that, for example, that was during the Iran-Contra case. That was the Senator Durnberger, who was the United States Senator from Minnesota, when he stood up on the floor of the Senate and demanded a major investigation by the Senate of the off-the-shore enterprise that was smuggling weapons to the Contras in violation of the Bolton Amendment. These three guys show up at the house and drag his wife out of bed and threaten to kill her and the family if he doesn't withdraw, which he then did. Okay. And then Senator Frank Church chairs the Church Committee, the Select Committee on Intelligence Abuse, and he starts demanding information from the CIA. And all of a sudden, millions of dollars mysteriously show up in his Senate district up in Idaho against him and oust him from office. And everybody knows about that in the Senate, in the House. So I mean, they're threatened not just to have somebody run against them or somebody primary them, in a kind of open constitutional process. We're talking about a criminal covert operation that is engaged in by the Central Intelligence Agency's Operations Directorate. They have these special teams that are assigned to go and physically spy on and intimidate members of the legislature. This is a fact. So that this is buried inside this whole UFO issue. There's this larger systemic problem that we have of the national security state having assumed the responsibility and authority to physically threaten members of Congress. Okay, and so that they're afraid, and those that aren't smart enough and informed enough to be afraid of that, are afraid of actually just having someone run against them, and be financed by the covert operations people. And so that's why the legislature doesn't do this themselves, but as Congressman Burleson points out, if in fact there's a virtual hue and cry generated on the part of the citizenry, you'll see them react. Because then what they'll be able to do, the Congress people will be able to turn to those people and say, look at, to their threatens, they say, look at, we've got to do this. If I'm going to be able to stay in office and help you and be careful not to reveal things that you don't want revealed, or not even demand information that you don't want to give me, in order for me to do that, I have to stay in office. And so I've got my constituents jumping up and down, with torches and pitchforks in my, district. And so I have to do this. And so that's the nature of the negotiation that goes on. Okay. And so that what we have to do, the citizens, people listening here today, and the people who listen to your show, and Jesse Michaels and Chris Ramsey and a lot of the other folks that are doing these things, that we have to get our citizens organized. We have to get them educated about this, because they all want to know. Virtually anybody you talk to, once they get past the intimidation of being told that they're mentally ill, if they believe UFOs are real, we're pretty well past that point now. I mean, we've got people at the highest levels telling them that this is true. And so the bottom line is, we citizens have to get active and do this, and demand that our congressional representatives who are going to be running for re-election here in November, that they need to sign a pledge card, which the New Paradigm Institute is drafting up and going to be providing. We've got teams now in 35 of the states. We're getting teams now in all 50 states, and we're going to get them down into each of the 435 congressional districts. And they're going to insist that the persons running for office sign the pledge card. And they need to support Eric Burleson, the congressperson's introduction of a standalone bill demanding that the UFO information be turned over to the Congress. Okay, so that's the answer to your question, and that's what's actually going on right now.
What's it going to take to get that bill passed? Like, what are they up against to get that passed?
They're up against the legacy group inside the executive branch,
influencing other representatives to vote against this.
Yeah, that's right. Threatening them, or bribing them by them going to their aerospace partners and having them give tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars, in some cases millions of dollars, in campaign contributions to those key people that chair certain committees, like the intelligence committees and the armed services committees, et cetera. And this is, again, it's a function of a more systemic problem that we have here, of these major corporations that are trying to get patents on this technology so they can own it, and then they can license it back to the government, for the next 100 years, and make trillions of dollars on it. And all the legacy group people have to do is touch them and say, here, call up the head of Lockheed Martin and say, look, here's Mike Turner, who's chairing the House Intelligence Committee. We want you to let him know that you're going to give $1 million to his next campaign, if he'll stop this bill from getting a rule in the House Rules Committee, and that's what they do. Now, I happen to know about all of this because I've studied it all my life, and I happen to be extremely familiar with what the processes are that go on inside the Congress. I'm perfectly aware of the relationship between the national security state and the general intelligence agencies and in military services. I'm familiar with that because I've studied it for 50 years. But that's the answer to your question, that there's no shirking our responsibility as citizens here. Everybody wants to be able to know, what can I do, like spending a minute maybe or two while I'm going to the Super Bowl or I'm going to the college national football championships, or I'm going to be sitting with my buddies watching it on television, rather than doing my job as a citizen. So the question is, how serious do people take this? How
Mm,
important do they think it is? Do people think it's important to know that there's an entire extraterrestrial civilization surrounding our solar system and that they've got beings coming and going from our planet? You know, do we have to be able to convince them that somehow it's going to reduce the cost of groceries, in order for them to do it? Or, it's going to, enable them to get fuel for their car, some energy source for their car or home,
mm,
for less money. And so we've got to raise the consciousness of our citizenry. That's
mm,
what you're doing. I mean, that's what you're here for. You're trying to raise the consciousness. You're trying to give them more information about things that they're curious about.
mm.
In this particular case, and this is a great subject because everybody is curious about this, and everybody
Right.
does want to know about this. And regardless of what your general political ideology is, anybody, once you can get past that indoctrination that they've been subjected to, which is we now know is a complete active covert operation going on by the Central Intelligence Agency's Operations Directorate to try to convince anybody and everybody that if you believe that UFOs are real, you are mentally ill. Because they actually had a program inside the military. Any military person who tried to report an encounter with a UFO was immediately discouraged by their superiors. Don't do this. This is not going to be good for your career. And if they insist upon doing it, the first thing that happens is they're ordered to go get a psychiatric exam. That's absolutely official. It was the absolute official line. You got to go get a psychiatric test. Okay. And that goes right into your record. So now we've spent, the last 80 years, I've spent 50 of those years working on this, ever since 1976. And so I know that we've made some headway here. We've gotten to a point where we've gotten enough people interested in it, and they put enough pressure on their Congress people to get some of the information. And the legacy group has its own agenda here of deciding that they're going to leak stuff out gradually in our ability to ascertain what their objectives are, what their schedule is, how much information are they willing to eventually release, and how much are they going to absolutely insist upon keeping secret. For example, the fact that they drug young children, to get them into a state of terror, to get them to leave their bodies so that they can exercise psychic capabilities, of to help pilot these craft. That's kind of a large mouthful there, but they're pieces of information like that they're never going to want to admit because I mean it's
Right.
going to subject them to criminal prosecution. So they're not going to let go of that no matter what you do. So we're going to have to dig that out through professional investigation, et cetera.
So, I mean, obviously, that's a huge conversation there, the psionic aspect of this whole thing where people are getting injured, getting too close to the stuff, frying their brains out. Like, that's a huge conversation to have, and I'm sure those
Sure.
people exist, and I'm sure they've been killed associated with this, and there's probably names that we'll never know of who that's happened to.
Mhm.
Some that we probably will find out in the future. I wanna talk about the legality of these private aerospace companies holding on to this tech, because it's my
Mm.
understanding that this tech was somewhat gifted to them,
Yep.
and in the age of disclosure, they kind of outline a little bit of the legacy program, how the CIA is kind of piggybacking this. I'm sure that's a very broad understanding, it's much more nuanced than that. But can you talk about, do they actually have legal precedents to hold this material?
Yeah. Well, it's that see, that very much depends, man, on what the nature of the agreement was that was made. When the US expends tax money to recover one of these craft, and they bring the technology to Lockheed Martin, for example, and they provide it to them, what are the conditions of that presentation? Or, the easiest one would be, here, we're the United States government, we're gonna hire you as a contractor to tell us how this works. If that were the agreement, if that were the nature of the agreement, then there's no problem because there's no ownership entailed in that. And so that if the government says, look, we still own the property, you're a hired contractor, you do this for us, we pay you, and then we still own the property. So we can demand it back at any time. And that's that. Now, on the other hand, if the aerospace corporation says, look, if we're going to do this, not only do you have to pay us, but the fact is we are going to insist upon acquiring some property interest in
Mhm.
the technology. If not the direct technology, then derivatives of it. Figure out what the basic principles are of physics of this technology, and we decide to make some other kind of product, then we want to own that. Okay. And we know that we can't apply for a patent, because if we apply for a patent to the patent office, they'll make it public. They've got to make the patent public so
Mhm.
that they can then license it to people who want to use it. Okay. So you can't do that. So that they're not going to grant a patent to it. So that the agreement will be that they have to have the right to utilize the technology that they discover on some ancillary derivative products. Now, if that's the nature of the contract, then you've got a challenge here on the part of the government. If you try to assert eminent domain, one of the major points of controversy in the UAP Disclosure Act, if you
Uh-huh.
exercise eminent domain, which you have the clear authority to do under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, then you have to pay the company just compensation for that if you're taking it back. And if you are prohibiting them from producing any kind of derivative products, then you have to pay them some kind of reasonable compensation if they've undertaken to develop a product and then they're not allowed to take it to market, right? Okay. So these are all things that the lawyers are all worrying about, and that the private aerospace industry has already thrown that one up. They've kicked that sand up into our face and said, oh, this is going to be really complicated. How do you unwind all of these arrangements? How do you find out what all the details of the arrangement were? Maybe it wasn't even written down.
Mhm.
Go, excuse me, you don't, spend your time whining to me. I mean, you took that risk when you did it, and so that we'll find out. We'll take depositions, we'll inquire, we'll subpoena your records to find out what kind of records there are of when you got the product, and what was the agreement that you had with them, who was alive that at the time, what kind of record has there been made of what the agreement was, even if it was oral. That these are things that can be done.
Right.
You can climb Mount Everest one opinion at a time,
Mhm.
and so we're not intimidated by that. The lawyers will
Right.
figure that out. But that's one of the challenges, and they just kick the sand up in all the legislators' faces by saying, "Oh, this is going to be terribly difficult." We're going to get screwed as business people. And that should appeal to you, especially
Mm.
since we're giving you campaign contributions.
Right. And so I guess the I don't know if this is a question or if this is an observation, but they want to get their patents in order so they can make money for the next 100 years, 1,000 years, whatever it is.
Yeah,
And then, but the problem is if they issue patents, then they've disclosed that it's
that's
all
right.
real. And they
That's
would
right.
rather this all just go away and continue business as usual, doing whatever it is they're doing. Is that
Secretly.
correct?
That's right. That is
Okay.
exactly right. They know that they can't apply for patents because it would result in having to make public what the technology is. And so they believe they've got some sort of tacit agreement, at least, with the United States government that they can function as though they had a patent, and they can keep other people from utilizing the technology in any way, but they don't have a patent. And so that they're in a trust relationship with the government. And the problem is, administrations change.
Mm,
The legislators all change. The people that are in charge of the intelligence committees change, and so that they're taking risk, a business
mm.
risk, when they can.
Leadership changes that are not
That's right.
okay with this type of business model.
That's
This is
right.
yeah, and so you probably have younger generations, new blood coming in, looking at this saying this is absolutely unacceptable that this
That's
has
right.
been operating like this, and it's probably just like, well, this is the way it's always been done for the last 80 years.
That's right.
Who are you to come in and change this, you
That's right.
30-some-year-old,
You
whoever?
know. Yeah. You're messing with the primordial order, and that's what this is. That this has been going on for 80 years, and it's the most deeply held secret on the part of our United States government, in the intelligence agencies, and that they're holding fast. But as I pointed out in passing, at least, that there's obviously some kind of agenda on the part of this legacy group to start dripping out certain pieces of information about this, as to why they're doing it, as to what the rate of the revelations are planned to be. We don't know. Our job as the citizens is to accelerate this process. And they keep saying, oh, if you only knew what we knew, you wouldn't be pressing on us so hard to accelerate this. I say, oh, excuse me, then I think it would be in your interest to tell me what it is. They said, well, you've got to have a security clearance. Okay, I'm not going to take a security clearance.
Right? Because they got you. They
I
own you.
represent the people, and we have public interest lawyers that represent the people. We have legislators that are supposed to be representing the people, and our job is to figure out what it is that our American citizens need to know, and our legislators need to know in order to exercise adequate oversight over this whole process. And that's bottom line what we're engaged in doing.
I gotcha. Danny, do you have a few more minutes for a few more questions, or do you got to
Sure I
go?
do. Sure I do.
Okay.
No, I'm good. I've
Okay.
set aside a whole hour here.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. So I guess what I want to ask you next is, there's all these stories floating around that some of the reasons why they don't disclose is more metaphysical and they're in cahoots with non-human intelligences. Do you lend any credence to that, or do you think this mostly has to do with money, power, and full spectrum dominance?
No. Well, there's two parts to the question that you ask, and that is, does it have something to do with these kind of metaphysical dimensions of things? It clearly does. I mean, there's no doubt at all that this technology involves things that have been traditionally inside our human culture dealt with under the rubric of spiritual or metaphysical dimensions of reality. It has to do with consciousness. It has to do with telepathic communications. It has to do with teleportation. It has to do with astral travel. And the fact is that those things that have been discussed by our human family historically as in the spiritual domain really are scientific questions. That is there something going on here? Is there some kind of subtle dimension of reality that is a much higher vibrational frequency, for example, than we've been able to measure with our technology at the present time? And if there is, what are the principles governing in that area? And I'm sure that over time we will find these things out by exploring linearly, But these other star systems in our galaxy, some of the stars, obviously, in our universe are as much as 6 billion years older
Far,
than
far
our
older
star.
than ours.
Like 6 billion years to be specific about it. I mean, the universe they've figured is 13.8 billion years old. Our star is only 4.5 billion years old. Our planet is only 3.7 billion years old. So our species is only, what? Even if you want to be reckless about it, 500,000 years old. When we've been actually having the kind of intellectual capacity to start probing into some of these things,
Mhm.
in these questions. They've had 6 billion years. Okay. So the odds are, even if you're just an incrementalist, that they've delved into these areas and they seem to know about them. That we now know that the craft that they come to our planet in are telepathically controlled. We know that. Okay. And we know that the craft actually are semi-sentient, that they actually have neurons and synapses and dendrites, in their wiring, and that the material that some of these craft are made out of is semi-organic in nature.
Mhm.
So obviously these species have figured out how to bioengineer, organic material, right?
Mhm.
And so that this flummoxes us from where we are right now. But on the other hand, we're just starting to do the same kind of stuff. We're starting
Right.
to try to, generate tissue and be able to transplant tissue from animals into human. We're carving away at the edges of this right now, but we're probably 2-3 billion years behind on this. And
Mhm.
so, yes, the answer is yes. There's clearly a metaphysical dimension to all this. And the second part of your question is some of the pushback that we're getting coming from that place of saying, well, there are people who hold certain, quote, spiritual beliefs or traditional religious beliefs that
Mhm.
are frightened about this. And they've been trained by those religious institutions to designate all of that inquiry as demonic,
Mhm.
that it's occult kind of stuff, which is hidden. That's all that occult means, is hidden.
Mhm.
It's concealed from the laity. But you've got Catholic monks and Buddhist monks and Hindu monks levitating in monasteries.
Mhm.
Okay. And they all know that. Not only that, but they kind of trickle it out to you, kind of a titillating point that should increase their institutional authority. That's
Mhm.
that's how they translate it. But the fact of the matter is that there's a good deal known in high religious circles about the capacities of our human bodies in our species, that are capable of. You have gospel passages, for example, after Pentecost, where the disciples come out from Pentecost, and they are addressing the people from different regions of the Middle East who have all come in for the festival holidays, and they're communicating with all the people in their own language. And so people say, "What is that about? Does that mean,
Right.
that Peter and Paul and John and the others, learned Swahili? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It
Mhm.
means that they're engaged in some kind of telepathic communication, and these are understood to be talents in the Bible. There's
Mhm.
in the Hindu traditions, but these are capabilities that our human family has. But the problem is that when our military and intelligence people encounter that phenomena, they immediately start trying to figure out how to make a weapon out of it.
Right.
And it's the old Sufi saying that I've said a number of times, is that the Sufi saying is, when a pickpocket meets a saint, all he sees are his pockets.
Right.
You know, and so they see this thing and they go, "Oh, great! That if I can teleport, I can spy on my adversaries." So they trained Pat Price up in the Stanford Research Institute to be able to go into military facilities and get inside their files and read their files. Psychic capacity, or worship. They actually train them to sit in a facility where they put a helmet on them and get them to generate the telepathic communications, and they try to amp it up with technology, and they direct the communication to, in this particular case, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan,
Mhm.
from a base, in the South Central Canada, and they have him telepathically communicating that all of it, and they focus the radio transmitters, or whatever they're transmitting, down to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And Pat Price telepathically asserts, you are to file your next federal income tax forms in this little post office box in this little nowhere town down in West Virginia. And 85% of the people did that.
Statistically significant, proving that this is actually a thing, right?
That's
This
right,
is
and it
right.
really works. And so they automatically say they're not just trying to get people to file their income tax in a particular place. They're trying to figure out how to subliminally give commands to people so that they can control the population. I mean, and then everybody goes, "Oh, that's totally crazy. That's all spooky, weird conspiracy stuff."
Mm.
It is conspiracy stuff, but it's conspiracy stuff that's real. This is
Right.
so they're conspiring together, because they're caught in a national security state context where they're in dialectical competition and conflict with other nation states. And that happens to be the state of development that we're in, our geopolitical structures on our planet right now, which is a reflection of the fairly low level of consciousness that we've
Mm.
evolved. And yet there are some individual human beings who developed a very high levels of consciousness, and they display these siddha, where they're capable of doing those kind of things. Like, for example, with Pat Price, that Pat Price, he was like a T4, a Theta 4 in the Church of Scientology. He had been trained to do this stuff.
It's my understanding that like your level of belief in this, it plays an important role. It may not be exactly what you believe, what doctrine you subscribe to, but how hard you believe it can probably influence your ability and strengthen your abilities in like these psychic connections. And so
It's
when you
absolutely
have like the Church of Science, you don't think so?
no. I said it's totally true.
It's
It,
totally true. Okay, yeah. So
it's
like when you
totally
have
true.
a
It's totally true.
right. So when you have an institution like Scientology, it may not necessarily be what they're teaching, but how devoted the people are to that. and then they can exploit that devotion or they can exploit that belief in training people up to do these things.
Just like the Catholic Church, and just like the
Right.
Buddhists, and just like the Hindus. I mean, what they do is they have a program for seeking out people who have some of these kind of basic talents, and they train them, and they bring them on inside the institution, and then they have to start raising funds to maintain the structures of the institution, and then, like any institution, it starts solidifying and ossifying, and then they become unreasonable, and they start suppressing the information, and instead of training their members up to actually display and exercise these important capabilities, they keep them secret. And then they not only that, but that they define them as occult, and that you will be excommunicated if you in fact tell anybody about this. And so that's what you have with Church of Scientology, the Catholic Church, and others.
Is it a legitimate concern that disclosure would like I have a hard time I wrestle with this a little bit because I don't have a specific religion that I subscribe to, but I mean, I believe in a higher power. But I have a hard time with the argument that it would disrupt religion too much to disclose this, and therefore that's a legitimate concern. Do you think that's a real concern, or is that something they use to offset and delay the disclosure?
Both. I think that their primary motivation is to put off and delay disclosure. But the fact of the matter is, there are some people inside military circles and intelligence circles who have a fairly low level of consciousness, even though they're extremely intelligent, and they've attached themselves to one of these belief systems, and that they believe that this is occult stuff, and we can't let people know about it. It's dangerous and it's demonic. That they've actually been trained inside their religious tradition to categorize all of that as demonic, and they aren't wise enough to recognize that that's a device that's been developed inside that religious institution to keep people from getting access to these talents, and in their mind, potentially abusing them.
Mhm.
And that so that everybody there thinks they're acting in good faith. The people inside the religious tradition think, look at these are dangerous faculties that people have, that our human species has, and our people have fairly low levels of consciousness. We're all aware of that. And so you don't want to just cast out pearl before the swine, and so that they don't tell people about it. And there's all the secret traditions that they talk about them with Christ. Christ would take his disciples aside and he would teach them these kind of private things that they never talked about at all to anybody. You have the persons of the gospel where Jesus takes two of his favorite disciples and they go off to a mountainside, and Jesus manifests himself as this gigantic, glowing being, and they see him there talking with Moses, and with who was it? Elijah, I think. And you go, oh wow, holy mackerel. And Jesus said, look, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody that you saw this. And of course,
Mhm.
they run right off and write up in their gospels and tell people about it. But the bottom line is, the answer is both is true. So you have a group like the Collins Group, for example, is kind of this little fraternity of people in the higher ranks of the military in the Pentagon who all have like a little prayer group together. I don't mean to speak disparagingly of it, but it's hard not to. But the bottom line is they will actually do like this. And in fact, I think Eric Davis was talking about it. He had one of these guys collar him in the Pentagon halls and said, this is all demonic. You guys better stop doing this because this is all satanic, you
Right,
know?
Lou said the same thing.
Yeah. And then they said, look, I couldn't even believe the guy was saying something like that to me. Yeah, but they
Yeah.
do. So you run into people of extremely low levels of consciousness who are sometimes very intelligent and very highly placed in military and corporations, intelligence communities, and even in Congress, who adhere to these really low level of understanding of reality.
Danny, I mean, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I just have a couple more questions for you.
Sure.
One, the passing of Dick Cheney, David Grush came out and said that he
Yes.
was probably one of the tips of the spears of this.
Yeah.
Since his passing, do you think this is part of like the old guard sort of moving away and like now there's leadership is in flux and there's an opportunity to really get more information out and drive this home? Is that a thing?
Well, I mean, you gotta understand, I mean, Bobby Ray Inman is still alive, he's 94 years old, and I don't know exactly what his faculties are, uh, but he was in a position of high authority, inside this legacy group, but you got other people who are younger, that O'Sullivan, is there, Stephanie O'Sullivan, and she was Clapper's right hand on this. She was his principal deputy when he was the director of national intelligence. You got Clapper himself, who is still very cogent. And that once you get into the inner circle of this thing, you don't get put out of it just because you go out of office. What you
Right.
do, you're brought into various offices like he was. Three-star general in the Air Force is involved in it. He's in, the defense, the director of national intelligence. He's inside the Pentagon. They move around in various positions structurally inside the system, but their bottom line is their power derives from them being part of the legacy group, and
Mm.
so that we know that they're operational, and we know that Cheney was. I mean, we had actually found the place. I mean, our office did, the Christic Institute that we began as, we're able to track where Cheney was functioning from. It was an old naval air station, an old abandoned naval air station down in Texas. And
Mm.
he had Blackwater security. They're all private
Private security.
at the position and had major facilities down there. And he would sneak off and go there. And he was exercising absolutely extraordinary levels of authority, well
Mm.
beyond any of his official capacities. So we knew that.
What last question. What type of information do you think the Vatican is sitting on? Are they playing a role in keeping this conversation squashed?
Well, yes. I mean, like they're keeping the conversation squashed on all kinds of things about the past of our human family. They're not going to tell people that that even though in the Gospels Jesus says to the disciples, he says, you will do greater things than I.
Mm.
Or when he says, that at the Last Supper, he says that eat of this bread, and if you understand that the stuff of which this bread is made up of is the same stuff that my body is made up of, and if you understand that the wine in this goblet is of the same stuff my blood is made up of, then you will know who I am. And it's right in your face. I mean, it's right there. They're talking about
Mhm.
it. But if you
Sh
don't understand any of that stuff, you think that, he's talking about like some of the fundamentals. He's talking about a cup of blood there. And so that people, depending upon their level of consciousness, are able to see and hear more and more subtle things. The dangerous part is that when you have people in the military, in the intelligence community, who are wedded to this dialectical confrontation with other nation states, in that they prism everything through that particular lens, and that they're trying to figure out how to weaponize all of this stuff, and they are the only ones who are having direct contact with the extraterrestrial beings,
Mhm.
other than those who are individual citizens who encounter them. That's why at the New Paradigm Institute, one of the things we're working on is to establish a diplomatic corps, a citizens diplomacy out
Mm.
directly to the extraterrestrials through a telepathic communication, training people with holotropic breathing so that they can avoid freaking out when they actually encounter one of these beings. Excuse me. And I started that with John Mack. I was representing John back at the peer group, the Project for Extraordinary Experience Research. But we've known that this dimension, this kind of quote spiritual dimension to this thing, has been an integral part of the whole thing. And therefore, as general counsel to the United States Jesuit headquarters in their social ministry office, I approach this thing with an open mind. But since I credit the information that's inside the spiritual communities, but I also know that this is real, and that this has a scientific kind of explanation if we could only understand it. And I know that
Mhm.
the ET people, having been 6 billion years, some of them older than we, have figured this out. Okay.
Mhm.
So that's why we're getting all these weird kind of things happening that the people from lower levels of consciousness can't quite understand. It looks like magic to them. How can a craft at 100 miles an hour just go into a mountain? How can
Right.
they go right into a mountain and disappear inside the mountain? How can they travel, at over 200, 300 miles an hour underwater? How can they possibly do that? The answer is they do it.
Right.
You
They
know,
figured it out.
there you go. They do it. And so given the fact that they do it, there's clearly some explanation as to how they do it.
Right.
But now this is like bleeding over into all the information about angels and angelic appearances and beings from another dimension, coming in and visiting us and sharing information with us, etc. And these two are starting to overlap. And part of our job at the New Paradigm Institute is to try to disentangle some of that information, which is completely mythological,
Hmm.
from that which was real, and try to understand where they're coming from, and what it's got to do with any of our religious traditions. And so that's the answer to the spiritual question.
Right. And I mean, once you start kind of going down the road and you start researching these topics, that conversation is intimately intertwined to this. You're not going to get away from it. You have to understand that aspect of it if you want to start to understand what they are doing and why
That's
what
right.
they're doing looks so anomalous.
That's
It's
right.
that they are taking advantage of a physics that I think we're just barely scratching the surface of
That's right.
ourselves here on the planet.
That is
Um,
right.
Danny, I really want to thank you for your leadership and your dedication to this topic. Please tell people about the New Paradigm Institute and what they can do to get involved.
Sure. That you should just go on the internet to newparadigminstitute.org, newparadigminstitute.org, and sign up to become members of the Citizens for Disclosure. That as I say, we've got people in 35 states now. We're going to get them in all 50 states. We're going to then move to have people in every one of the 345 congressional districts, or 435 congressional districts. Yeah. And we've got to raise the hue and cry. That's an historical common law activity on the part of the citizenry. That's how they used to all gather together when a criminal was amidst them in engaging in criminal conduct. And the people who saw that happening would raise a hue and cry, just like they are in Minneapolis right now. They're getting the whistles and blowing the whistles and jumping up and down and hollering when these ICE people come in and invade their community. We have a criminal element that's deep inside our national security state. They're engaging in criminal activity. They're threatening citizens. They're actually killing people. They're interfering with our congressional representatives. They're violating our democratic principles, our Constitution, and our laws. And they have to be held accountable. And the people that we have hired and voted for to do this are in the Congress. And so that the Citizens for Disclosure is specifically designed to be able to reach out to your congressional representative and your senators and to get them to fulfill their constitutional obligations. It doesn't do any good just to say, oh, this is your responsibility. It's not only their responsibility, it's their absolute duty. It's their job description. And if they don't do it, then you get somebody else
Mhm.
in there. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to give the people that are in there a chance to fulfill their responsibilities and their constitutional obligations. And if they don't, if they won't, whatever the reasons are, the rationale that they provide for it, get rid of them and you replace them with people who will do that. Okay. And will do it responsibly because, that they're going to have to help participate in amending the major structures of our culture, our economic structures, that our whole economy is rooted in the concept of scarcity, that there are very limited natural resources and they're in competition for them. And therefore, if you can get your hands on some of the natural resources, you have a greater wealth and you can use it to exchange for other things. The whole system is set up like that. But if you have access to the stars and to the planets all throughout our galaxy, you're not going to have that kind of scarcity. And
Mhm.
so there's going to have to be a different economic structure for our people, for developing resources and distributing the value of the resources, et cetera. And we're going to have different geopolitical structures. We can't have nation states fighting with each other and competing with each other over Greenland or something. Well, we've got an extraterrestrial civilization that we're trying to kind of figure out how we're going to interact with them. We need to develop a mutually beneficial and prosperous relationship with the extraterrestrial civilization. This isn't, I could say it isn't rocket science, but it turns out it is. So, that's it. Get a hold of the newparadigminstitute.org, sign up to become members of the Citizens for Disclosure, join the group that's in your state, already, and help set yours up in your congressional district. This is an extraordinarily exciting undertaking here. I mean, this is the real deal. This is the call to you as citizens to make our democracy work. Let's demonstrate to the world that the 5% of us out of the whole population of our planet who happen to live in the United States, who have the opportunity to actually exercise democratic rights in our culture, to call out our government and make them release this information to the world and help save our world. Okay, help save our species, help establish our species so that we merit respect on the part of this extraterrestrial civilization. Not to view us like chimpanzees or something.
Mhm.
We've got to earn this respect. So we're going to have to ascend in our consciousness collectively and individually, and come to the New Paradigm Institute, become a member of the Citizens for Disclosure, and you get weekly bulletins from us regularly and details. It will. I mean, half the people in the country don't even know who their congressman is. I mean, really, that's kind of embarrassing. So it's time for us to do our duty here, that we are privileged to be the 4 generations that exist now, that are alive now on our planet. We're the ones that are going to be helping to develop the principles, policies, and programs pursuant to which we have our relationship with the extraterrestrial civilization for the next 10,000 years. I mean, you
Mhm.
got to understand the opportunity that you have here, but
Mhm.
you're not going to do it by sitting around as couch potatoes. You got to get busy.
And,
And
and and I think we should also just lay out to everybody, it is easier than ever now to contact your representatives. You can send an email directly to their office. It's really just a matter of going to their websites, Googling their names,
yeah,
and sending them an email and letting them know what you're concerned about.
exactly. And not only that, but now it's even easier because the New Paradigm Institute will draft your email for you. You know,
Right.
and all you have to do is sign to be a member and push the little button and say bang, and there it goes. And it goes right straight to your congressperson, and they're going, oh, here comes another one. Here
Mhm.
there's somebody sitting there in their office adding up how many of these they're getting. Uh,
Mhm.
and are these people willing to potentially vote for somebody else if we don't
Mhm.
do our job? That's just the way it is. So join us, Citizens for Disclosure. Go to newparadigminstitute.org, and we'll get right back to you.
Danny, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. And like I said, you're a real thought leader and mover and a shaker in this space. So thank you.
Terrific. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.